From floods to droughts, wildfires and rising sea levels, 2021, a year of extreme weather events that brought new focus to the climate change crisis. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Experts are once again warning about the clear and present danger of climate change after deadly storms ripped through parts of the United States, killing dozens. Multiple tornadoes touched down in several states across the Midwest and Southeast in a span of less than 24 hours. Images of widespread destruction and a death toll that continues to climb have left local communities reeling. CGTN's Dan Williams brings us the latest.
Here in Mayfield, Kentucky, the cleanup operation is continuing, but as you can see, there's still a huge amount to do. Block after block, house after house has been completely leveled in this downtown area, and you can still see there are twisted hunks of metal, cars upturned, buses completely smashed apart all around this downtown area, and of course house after house demolished, left in rubble, and of course those that are still standing, many of those will also need to be demolished as well. They are unfit for habitation, so they too, many of those will also have to be destroyed. Now, of course, the search and rescue efforts, that continues here. We know and we've seen police sniffer dogs and canine units going through the rubble, going house to house, trying to find the potential of survivors. Now, all of this is happening, of course, before the visit of US President Joe Biden, who will be here in person on Wednesday, and he'll be able to survey the damage, the destruction caused by these horrific tornadoes for himself. And he'll also be able to talk to some of the residents here as well, get an idea as to what help has so far been of benefit, what has worked, and also what still needs to happen. Of course, the building back process here in Mayfield and some of the other towns that were in the path of these tornadoes, the building back process, that will potentially take many years. And so it gives a chance for the residents here, the business owners here, a chance to talk to the US President and potentially appeal for help. Dan Williams, CGTN, Mayfield, Kentucky.
Now, throughout the year, we've seen this again and again. Record-breaking heat, deadly forest fires, unprecedented rain, and persistent drought. Thousands dead and billions of dollars lost. Are we past the tipping point? Well, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Chicago, Illinois, is Thomas Gale. He is the CEO of the Wharton Education Group. Out of Boca Raton, Florida, John Englander is an oceanographer and expert on climate change. He's also the author of Moving to Higher Ground, Rising Sea Level and the Path Forward. And here in Washington, D.C. is Sweta Chakraborty. She is the president of U.S. operations at We Don't Have Time, a review platform for climate solutions. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Sweta, let me start with you, and let's talk about those tornadoes that touched down in the Midwest and in the Southeast, causing extensive damage and resulting in the deaths of up to 100 people. Now, many people have been asking the question, has this got anything to do with climate change? And a lot of people have been trying to answer that question. Here's one of them. Let's listen.
It's certainly true that climate change is making it more likely to have intense tornadoes outside of the usual season we think of. I mean, the March through June period where you get most of the violent tornadoes, because now it's warmer longer and you can have these favorable conditions for tornadoes at different times of the year.
So, Sweta, that was Jeff Masters there at the Yale Climate Connections. What is your view on whether this is connected to climate change?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So tornadoes form not all the time during thunderstorms, less than 10% of the time, which is a small sample size, which is why we're not able to say more confidently that there's a direct link between climate change and tornadoes, but all the evidence is pointing in that direction. The idea is that now that we have warmer temperatures, we are seeing that combination of warmer air that you have, and then you have drier air coming over it, and that creates this updraft, which results, if you have then wind instability, can then result in tornadoes. And again, that doesn't happen all the time, but increasingly, as we're seeing warmer temperatures throughout longer periods of time throughout the year, now we are seeing the increased likelihood and frequency of tornadoes forming. And the United States has the most tornadoes of any country in the world, so it's no surprise that we're going to see that increase in tornadoes taking place in this country. This tornado season concept is going to become increasingly all year round. This is what we anticipate with the planet warming. We're seeing that to be true with wildfires. We're seeing it to be true with drought and access to water. We're seeing it to be true with hurricanes and heavy precipitation events. So these impacts of climate change are all following this similar pattern of increased frequency and intensity, and it is, yes, linked to climate change.
John, one of the other distinguishing characteristics that we saw about these tornadoes that touched down is that they followed a different path from the normal tornado path that we've seen in past years. I mean, if we look over the past year, there have been extreme weather conditions that's been responsible for storms, for flooding, for heat waves around the country. We've seen farmers who've been battling drought, and we saw all those wildfires consume entire towns. I mean, is this going to get worse?
Unfortunately, it is. It's almost certainly, because the planet is 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than it was a century ago. And as we know from the climate conference recently in Glasgow, we're trying to keep the warming to 1.5, which means we are accepting that at the best case, we're going to have 20% more warming. And it's heat going into the system that generates tornadoes, thunderstorms, hurricanes, ocean current changes. So it makes perfect sense. If you put more heat in the system, just like putting a pot of water on the stove and turning up the heat, you can see the currents change. We're going to see the effects of more heat in the Earth climate system.
And will conditions also get progressively worse? I mean, will we see tornadoes, for instance, having a bigger impact?
Well, it's hard to predict weather precisely, of course, but we are seeing more rainfall, record-breaking rain, atmospheric rivers, as they're sometimes referred to now, where these atmospheric currents bring tremendous amounts of moisture, as is happening now to the west coast of the United States. We're seeing strange hurricane patterns, strange tornado patterns, ocean currents changing. Again, we're putting more heat in the system. We're going to see more droughts, more heavy rainfall, record-breaking floods, and the pattern will overall continue. It's hard to be precise about where and when.
Thomas Gale, welcome to the show. Great to have you with us. John mentioned the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, which took place not so long ago. One of the things that came out of that Congress was that joint declaration by the United States and China pledging to intensify efforts to combat climate change. In fact, one of the things that China's climate envoy told the gathering, he said, we need to think big and be responsible. So what would China like to see happen when its envoy talks about we'd like to think big?
Well, I've been fortunate to live in China for the past 6 years and have seen how effective the government can be in combating some of these problems. I think China's main philosophy for getting to a carbon neutral society is really to replace coal with nuclear power and sustainable energy. By 2060, they predict that their energy mix will be almost half and half nuclear and renewables, with coal and oil falling pretty much off the table. So I think in expanding those goals and accelerate the timing that they have can make a critical difference. Unfortunately, we have to tie it into not only China and mainland China, but also the Belt and Road Initiative is said to be substantially increasing the climate change aspect as well. Over 70% of the energy projects that are done by the Belt and Road initiatives are not sustainable energy products. So they're generally coal and adding more CO2 into the atmosphere. So I think those are the things that we'll see if China decides to speed up their ability to put nuclear plants online. They're now doing it in a homegrown method, the Holon reactor they're using is 80% made in China.
Yeah.
So they're able to do that very quickly and efficiently now.
But Thomas, China has made a pledge, as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, that it will no longer finance coal-powered plants in its foreign development program.
No, and absolutely right, and that will make a huge difference, because that just came out about 4 months ago, and it was a welcome declaration from China, and shows their commitment in trying to move the ball forward.
And very briefly, actually, you were talking about those targets that China are trying to hit, reach to peak emissions by 2030 and to have neutrality by 2060. From what you see right now, are those on target?
Yes, I believe so. But unfortunately, China is still building coal generation facilities to accommodate the energy needs in the country. So between now and 2030, they'll build as much generation capacity as the entire United States right now. So obviously that creates a very large carbon footprint. If there was some way of going and rationing the companies who needed the energy to a more efficient system, instead of having the cement manufacturers, the steel manufacturers, some of the very high consumers limit what they're doing or scale it back until we can bring the nuclear online or find renewables to be able to help, it would make a huge difference.
Shweta, the UN Security Council met recently and they met to vote on a resolution to label climate change an international peace and security threat. But that resolution was actually vetoed by Russia, which said that it would turn a scientific and economic issue into a politicized question. What do you make of that?
So that's always been the issue, is being able to frame climate change as a peace and security issue, and that's not where it sits in the UN's framework, but there's been international pressure to change that. There is an alliance of militaries across the world now that is referred to as the International Military Council on Climate Change, and it is a group that is looking to recognize climate change as a common enemy. And so clearly, climate change is a security issue for countries' sovereignties and for collective regional security and for global security. So blocking this idea of climate being considered a security issue really does not make sense, considering that literally the most vulnerable nations on the planet's very sovereignty is at risk. If that isn't a security issue due to the warming planet, then what are we concerned about in terms of the ability of countries to stay alive in the future?
John England, developing countries made their voices heard at the COP26 summit, and one of the points they made was that while they are bearing the worst effects of climate change, I mean, if we look, there's been flooding, there's been climate refugees, droughts, etc., but they have been the least responsible for climate change right now. In fact, one Ugandan activist, Vanessa Nakate, has been talking about that. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Communities are experiencing loss and damage right now. And like I say, we cannot adapt to starvation. We cannot adapt to extinction. We cannot adapt to lost cultures, to lost traditions, to lost histories. And the climate crisis is taking all of these things away.
So, John, are you confident that the developing world can get on board with all these undertakings and promises that were made at COP26? I mean, they're going to need a lot of help from the developed world, aren't they?
They are, Anand. And I hate to say I'm not confident. It's great they're trying. Some of the gestures and commitments made at Glasgow are admirable, but history says that after 26 years of this, our actions don't meet our promises globally. And as that person just indicated, the effects of climate change, whether it be wildfires, whether it be droughts, whether it be flood rains, whether it be sea level rise, do not fall on the same place that created the greenhouse gases. That's the triggering agent. So there is inequity. We think of sea level rise, my specialty, as you know, there's 140 nations that are exposed to rising oceans. And it's said that about 20 or 30 are vulnerable to essentially going underwater this century. So those nations that are most vulnerable are not the ones that are putting the most carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There is inequity, and we need to be very aware of that and help those that didn't create the problem but are most vulnerable.
Thomas Gale, looking at the situation in the United States, there's politics involved here as well. Shortly after that declaration that I was talking about that was made by China and the United States, President Biden announced that, or in fact, he took action. He started signing a number of permits that would grant oil companies drilling rights. It was more than 300 of them. So doesn't that put a question mark over the U.S. commitment to climate change?
I think it does. And unfortunately, we've had a mixed message, and different, obviously, coming out of the last administration was really a mixed message. Now we were getting a little bit more focused, but then when you have these competing economic interests versus the political and societal on a global scale, they're not always held in the same category. So I'm disappointed that those things would happen, particularly when we had reduced so much of our oil exploration and stopped so many of the projects. To bring them back, I think, is just a sign of, buckling to some of the interests that says that, United States wants to be energy independent. And so those are all difficult concepts to try to kind of bring together.
Shweta, I've just got a little bit of time left, but I want to ask you about the role that young people are playing in the fight against climate change. In fact, there was a report on the BBC which said that young activists are not just standing on streets or at least staging demonstrations, standing on streets with placards. They're now taking action. They've sued governments and companies to take action, and they are winning. How significant is that?
It's very significant, and it's not just young people, it's the actions of young people that are inspiring generations that should have already acted on it. But just here in the United States, for example, 55 million Americans label themselves as alarmed by climate change but don't know what to do about them. And it's the parents and the grandparents. So seeing young people really rally together and to cry for climate action is also now inspiring these parents and grandparents to also move. So now we can get that groundswell of the public to really stand up and demand that those representatives voted into power actually pass legislation that is going to secure the future for young people. Part of that legislation is the Build Back Better Act that's making its way through the Senate right now in the United States. It couldn't be a more critical time to see the investment needed towards a green and clean future, energy future, so that the U.S. can show, look, we aren't just talking here, we're actually acting, and it's a blueprint for what other countries can do to follow suit for that clean energy transition.
Shweta, very quickly, in under 30 seconds if you can, when people say we don't know what to do, what would you like to see?
I would like to see people actually recognize the power of coming together, to connecting some of the dots, and to use other people's challenges that were overcome similarly to overcome challenges that unique individuals and communities are facing to develop that resiliency to climate.
Okay, and we need to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We are turning now to food waste, which has a major impact on our climate. According to a United Nations report, we're wasting almost 1 billion tons of food globally each year, and most of it is perfectly edible. I recently spoke with Matt Homewood, an award-winning food waste campaigner from Copenhagen. He's on a mission to end supermarket food waste in Denmark and beyond. Matt, when we talk about food waste, there was an interesting analogy that was made. One of the UN agencies, the Food and Agricultural Organization, says that if food waste was a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter behind China and the United States. How did we get to this point where we waste so much food?
You're right, it's an astonishing statistic. And if you actually convert that into global greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking 10% of annual emissions come from food waste. Now, of course, it is a complex problem. We've got global supply chains. So from farm to fork, we're talking about 40% of food waste. It's an astonishing situation. And I started this work 3 years ago by starting an Instagram page called An Urban Harvester, which focused specifically on supermarket food waste, which actually isn't the biggest problem, but it's the one I had access to. And that's why I've used that supermarket food waste as a prism, as a tool to explore wider issues of food waste from farm to fork.
Now let's talk about that. You are an urban harvester. Sometimes that's very derisively referred to as a dumpster diver, but you regularly retrieve perfectly edible food from waste bins or dumpsters at supermarkets. What have you found?
What have I not found is more the question. I mean, pizzas, all sorts of fruit and vegetables, basically everything you find in the store, between 1% and 5% of that ends up in the dumpster. And from an environmental and social perspective, I've started focusing more and more on meat and dairy because, you know, meat and dairy use 83% of global farmland, yet only produces 18% of the calories. So meat and dairy is a very inefficient way of using our limited resources on planet Earth. And so to find that much meat and dairy in the dumpster is seriously disturbing. So that's why I focus on that so much. But it's quite mind-blowing what one might find in there. And it isn't just perishable products. That's what's most disturbing. You can find a lot of shelf-stable products like cans of tuna, for example.
And actually, the production of meat and dairy is itself bad for the atmosphere, isn't it?
Absolutely. Meat and dairy, just because of basic biological systems, converting plant matter into animal matter is a very inefficient way of production. But of course, it's part of human history, so that's something we have to deal with. But wasting meat and dairy is absolutely unacceptable, and that's why I focus on that so much. And when we see supermarkets wasting that meat and dairy on the scale that they do, sometimes without even a discount sticker on those products, then we know something has gone wrong. And that's why I campaign so hard to try and raise public consciousness about this problem. And once we get enough people on board, we can try and campaign governments to start placing a tax, in a way, on food waste, because we know that from a social and environmental perspective, it's a massive problem. So say, for example, a supermarket paid $50 per ton of food waste for that disposable. If that was suddenly increased to $500 or say $5,000 per ton, you'd see supermarkets radically change their overstocking practices and especially hoarding. Because, for example, I found 157 packets of bacon which had passed their use-by date, but they had no discount stickers. And why is that? Because basically the cost of that waste is too low. So from a cost-benefit analysis from the supermarket, essentially it pays to waste. And that's what we need to change.
Right, now you've done something about this, Matt, but how can we as individuals reduce food waste?
So yeah, I don't focus on consumers as much as some other people do, organizations, and that's because consumers essentially do waste a lot of food, and that is a significant problem, but it's very irrational, because when consumers throw food away at home, they're literally throwing out their hard-earned money. But there are many things we can do. So from government's perspective, we can improve the educational resources at hand, get home economics back on the agenda. We can use our fridge better, our food stocking essentially, and preservation in the kitchen and larder. So there are many things that we can do as individuals, but I focus more on the commercial aspect, because we know that these business models are across an entire nation quite profitable, and it's that insidious behavior that I think needs acting upon. And you know, governments have many instruments at their disposal. They can use tax breaks, they can use taxes to, of course, shift that behavior. So we can increase discounting practices, we can increase charitable donations. Where you are in Washington, D.C., the USA, actually, believe it or not, is one of the great food wasters on this planet from a supermarket perspective. But we have federal legislation called the Bill Emerson Act, introduced in 1996, which minimizes liability for all supermarkets and the non-profits who get that food. So really, in the USA, there should be no supermarket food waste. But after 25 years, we still only see 20% of food donated to charities, even though 35 million US citizens are food insecure. So it's the great paradox of the US food system as well as the global food system.
You've made a presentation to the COP26 conference in Glasgow in Scotland. What was your message to them?
So yes, I've delivered a talk at the COP26 where my message is quite simple, really. I focus on supermarket food waste because that's the evidence I have at hand. I focus on Denmark, essentially, retracing the story of how I got to this stage. And then through social media networks, I have received and been inundated, quite frankly, by other dumpster divers across the Western world who have shared with me their work. So from Germany to Finland to Australia to the USA, I've got photos demonstrating this absurd supermarket food waste. So we'll be going on a global journey, and then I want to talk solutions. There are many market-based solutions like Y-Waste or Waste Less, which offer, for example, dynamic pricing solutions, or Throw No More, which digitalizes reduced products. But these require investments from supermarkets, and so that's why I believe we need a more systemic solution from governments. So that's why I want to talk about legislative solutions. So for example, that tax I talked about earlier to increase the cost of wasting this perfectly edible food, or to incentivize charitable donations, because quite frankly, turning this perfect food into biogas or waste for energy, as they call it, is very inefficient. For example, a ton of tomatoes will only retrieve 0.75% of the total energy that went into growing those tomatoes in the first place. So it's important to be very clear with our thinking when we talk about food waste, and the best solutions we have at hand. Prevention will always be the best course of action.
Matt, you're a young person and you are clearly deeply involved in the amount of food that we waste, the impact it has on the environment, the impact it has on climate change. We are seeing more and more young people get involved in this battle. How important is it for youth around the world to get involved?
I think it's absolutely essential. Luckily, I see a lot of the older generations also getting involved, but it's true. The youth are going to be on planet Earth much longer. They've yet to have children. Many are not even sure if they want children, which I think is a shame. But I think it is so important to get as many people on board, because the environmental and social issues impact us all. And I think in the global north, where, you know, we are privileged, we have a massive responsibility to take action, because historically and today we must change our systems to make it much more equitable, because at the moment it's people in the so-called global south who are having the greatest impact from climate change and other environmental impacts when they have done the least amount. So I'm delighted to see so many youth getting involved, and it's fantastic, and it gives me hope.
Matt, thanks for joining us. And that's where we have to leave it. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.